The year was 1382, and the sun never quite rose over Naples the way it used to. Queen Joanna. I had ruled the kingdom of Naples for nearly 4 turbulent decades. Her reign was marked by blood, betrayal, and beauty. And now, at age 56, whispers of treachery were thick in the corridors of Castelnuovo. Born into privilege yet hardened by politics, Joanna was a woman forged in the fires of dynastic ambition. She had outlived 3 husbands, survived a papal excommunication, and walked the razor's edge of civil war. To some, she was a saintly queen, wise, just, and beloved. To others, she was a murderess in velvet gloves. But on this particular April morning, a strange hush had fallen over her court. Servants avoided her gaze, guards exchanged furtive looks, and above the thick stone walls of her castle a storm was gathering, not of thunder, but of steel and silence. Joanna did not know it yet, but the plot to end her life had already begun. To understand the slow creeping tragedy that would engulf Queen Joanna, one must first peer through the fractured mirror of her kingdom, a glittering realm of art, intrigue, and rot. The kingdom of Naples in the 14th century was a jewel in southern Europe. Rolling hills bloomed with vineyards. Monasteries whispered in Latin beneath sunlit arches. Trade flowed like lifeblood through its ports, and its court glittered with poets, musicians, and philosophers. But beneath the gold leaf and frescoes lay something darker, a nation at war with itself. Joanna had ascended the throne in 1343 at the age of just 15, following the death of her grandfather, King Robert the Wise, a monarch revered for his diplomacy and piety. His passing was meant to mark the beginning of a golden era under his bright young heir. It did not. The trouble was not that Joanna was incapable. Far from it. She was intelligent, multilingual, and politically shrewd. But she was also a woman, and in a medieval world where crowns were expected to rest only on male brows, her very existence was a provocation. From the moment of her coronation, Joanna faced enemies who believed she had no right to rule. The nobility grumbled that she was too young, too soft, too fond of foreign advisers. The clergy whispered that a woman on the throne was an offence against divine order. And abroad, other dynasties watched with predatory eyes, seeing opportunity in her vulnerability. In an attempt to secure her position, Joanna was married off to Prince Andrew of Hungary, a member of the powerful Anjou dynasty. The match was meant to unite Naples and Hungary under a single royal house. Instead, it planted the seeds of decades-long bloodshed. Andrew was not her equal. He was rash, immature, and politically ambitious, emboldened by letters from his mother, Queen Elizabeth of Hungary, encouraging him to seize power. Within a year of their marriage, Andrew began pushing for coronation in his own right. He claimed he had been promised the crown alongside Joanna. She refused. And then in 1345, Andrew was dead. It happened at Aversa, in a private hunting lodge north of Naples. Andrew had retired to bed alone. In the middle of the night, a group of armed men broke into his chambers. He screamed, he struggled, they overpowered him, strangled him with a cord, and, as if to emphasize the message, flung his corpse from a window. He was 17 years old. The murder shocked Europe. And though Joanna denied any role in the assassination, few believed her. After all, who benefited from Andrew's death more than the young queen who had resisted sharing power? The Hungarian court was outraged. Queen Elizabeth, Andrew's mother, demanded vengeance. In their eyes, Joanna was not just a widow, she was a regicide. Naples began to fracture. Joanna's enemies at home seized on the scandal to question her legitimacy. Abroad, the Hungarian monarchy plotted retribution. And in Rome, even the Pope began to distance himself from the young queen, uncertain whether to defend her or denounce her. But Joanna was not easily crushed. She convened a tribunal to investigate the murder, one that, unsurprisingly, found her innocent. She married again to Louis of Taranto, a man of military skill and political loyalty. Together they beat back a Hungarian invasion in 1350 and reasserted her authority over a kingdom in chaos. For a time, it seemed, Joanna had survived the worst. She outlived the scandal, she ruled, She reformed. She transformed Naples into a center of learning and culture, and, for the next 3 decades, she held on to power through marriages, diplomacy, and sheer force of will. But enemies have long memories, and royal blood once spilled calls for more. By 1380, Hungary had crowned a new king, Charles of Durazzo, a man with his own claim to Naples, and a hatred of Joanna inherited like a bloodline. He came not as a rival. He came as an executioner. The man who would bring Queen Joanna's story to its dreadful climax was not a stranger. Charles of Durazzo had grown up within reach of her shadow, raised in the very court he would one day betray. He was a cousin, distant in blood, but close enough in ambition. His mother was Margaret of Naples, sister to Joanna's father, and from childhood he had been groomed to believe the throne might one day be his. But where Joanna learned diplomacy and grace, Charles learned resentment. He had watched her rule with elegance, even as the Anjou family fractured into jealous branches. He had listened to advisers speak of Joanna with awe, and of his own mother with pity. The court may have smiled at Charles, but it had never bowed. When he was still a boy, Joanna sent him away from Naples, adopting Louis of Taranto as her consort and strengthening her grip on power. Charles never forgot the exile, nor did he forgive it. Years passed, Joanna ruled, and Charles waited. But by the early 1380s, time had begun to conspire against the aging queen. Her 4th husband, Otto of Brunswick, was more decoration than defender. The once stable kingdom was fraying, pulled apart by unrest, banditry, and noble squabbling. Even the papacy, once her greatest ally, was now torn between 2 competing popes, Urban VI in Rome and Clement VII in Avignon. Joanna, ever shrewd, made a bold move. She declared allegiance to the Avignon Pope, Clement VII, a French-backed pontiff opposed by much of Italy, and, most dangerously, by Urban VI himself. Urban declared her a heretic, and that was the moment Charles had been waiting for. In a storm of papal fury and political calculation, Urban VI offered Charles something no pope had granted before: legitimacy. With one papal decree, he named Charles the rightful king of Naples, sanctioning war in the name of divine justice. Charles accepted the crown like a blade. By 1381, he was in Hungary, raising troops. The blood feud that began with Andrew's murder decades earlier was about to be paid in full. But Charles was no mere invader. He moved with surgical precision, manipulating allegiances, turning nobles, and poisoning minds long before his sword left the sheath. Even before his fleet crossed the Adriatic, Joanna's kingdom had begun to crumble from within. In Naples, her allies wavered. Her advisers urged caution, but the queen would not flee, not this time. "I have ruled too long," she told a confidant, "to abandon my crown to wolves." Charles landed in Italy in late summer of 1381. By early 1382, his army was marching southward like a judgment. Joanna's soldiers, demoralized and divided, barely resisted. One by one, her castles surrendered. Towns opened their gates. Former allies pledged fealty to the invader. By May, Charles had reached the gates of Naples. But Joanna was not there. She had retreated to a place of memory and refuge. Castel San Fele, high in the hills of Muro Lucano, where the stones still whispered of her youth and glory. It was there, in that lonely fortress, that the queen awaited her fate. She wrote letters, she prayed. And in the dark hours of morning, she stood on the castle's western wall and watched the sky burn gold over the mountains, unsure if it would be her last sunrise. Charles was close now, not just to her gates, but to her throat. Castel San Fele, perched among the brooding mountains of Muro Lucano, was never meant to be a tomb. Built as a retreat, a place for princes and scholars to contemplate the heavens, it now held a queen awaiting death. And yet, as Joanna passed through its heavy iron gates in the spring of 1382, she did not appear broken. There was something deeply unsettling about her composure. She did not wail or demand her guards rally. She did not curse Charles or cry out for the mercy of God or man. Instead, she walked its halls with the quiet of someone long acquainted with ghosts. The fortress, however, was no longer hers. The men who guarded her now, many of whom once served in her own court, had switched allegiance to Charles of Durazzo. These were not the polished knights of Naples with banners and vows. They were rough mercenaries, driven by coin and fear. And worse still, they had orders not to protect the queen, but to keep her visible, to remind Naples and all of Europe that the lioness was now caged. Within those stone walls, time became cruel. Joanna was denied letters, visitors, even candles after sundown. Her ladies-in-waiting, loyal companions for decades, had been dismissed, scattered, or imprisoned themselves. She ate alone, walked alone, dreamed alone. The servants who entered her chamber no longer spoke. Some refused to meet her eyes, and then the silence grew heavier. One morning, her books were removed. The next, the small carved crucifix she kept by her bedside vanished. Finally, her rosary, a gift from her first husband Andrew all those years ago, was taken without a word. It was not brutality that surrounded her. It was erasure. The aim, it seemed, was not just to end Joanna's life, but to strip her of identity before the blade fell, to make her not a queen, not even a woman, just a problem, solved quietly at the edge of the map. Meanwhile, Charles of Durazzo rode into Naples to the roar of church bells and cannon fire. He wore a crimson cloak, thick with Hungarian embroidery, and declared himself King Charles III. From the steps of Castelnuovo, the very palace where Joanna had once ruled, he addressed the crowd as if her reign had been a nightmare from which Naples was now waking. But even as he staged ceremonies and issued decrees, he hesitated. There was something symbolic about Joanna. She was not merely an obstacle, she was a legend. And legends, even when dying, cast long shadows. Killing her would send a message, but so would sparing her. What if he paraded her through the city in chains? What if he imprisoned her for life, feeding her to the gossip mills of Europe? Advisers whispered of options, bishops counselled mercy, but there was one voice Charles trusted above all, that of his wife, Margaret of Durazzo. She hated Joanna with a quiet, unwavering precision. She had not forgotten how Joanna once tried to marry her off to a distant foreign noble, a political match meant to secure the Queen's own power, nor had she forgotten how her own line had been overlooked for succession. Now, Margaret stood in the throne room of Naples and uttered words her husband never forgot. So long as she breathes, the world will doubt your crown. That was the moment the decision was made. The silence of Castel San Fele was about to be broken, not with words, but with footsteps, keys, and a length of coarse, blood-soaked rope. The morning the guards came for her, the wind outside Castel San Fele whispered like an omen. Joanna had awoken before dawn. She could no longer tell one day from the next in this place, but she still followed her rituals, fingers laced in silent prayer, slow sips of water from the clay cup beside her cot, a glance toward the small window cut into the stone wall, her only link to the outside world. It had rained during the night. The mist clung to the hills like mourning veils. Somewhere, far below, a bell from a shepherd's chapel tolled. She listened, counting. Then came the footsteps. She knew the difference now, the shuffle of a servant versus the rhythm of boots. These were soldiers, 4 of them. No orders barked, no greetings offered, just the dull clatter of metal as keys turned in her door. They stood there for a moment, watching her, their expressions hidden beneath helmets and coifs. She did not flinch. The eldest of the 4, a man with a grey streak down his beard and a tremor in his hand, stepped forward. "We right," he said. Joanna rose without a word. She was wearing a faded green gown, the embroidery along its sleeves frayed from age, no jewellery, no crown. Her hair, once golden, now streaked with silver, was bound in a simple braid. She looked more like a village midwife than a monarch, and yet, as she walked through the halls of Castel San Fele for the last time, her bearing was unmistakably regal. She did not plead, did not ask where they were taking her. She already knew. They led her through a narrow passage, once used by monks. Outside, 2 horses waited, not carriages, no procession, no trial. This would not be a public execution.
That would have been mercy.
They rode in silence for hours, following a jagged trail into the deeper hills. The mist thickened, turning trees into pale silhouettes. A raven followed them for part of the journey, its croak like laughter in the greyness. Joanna recognized the path. They were heading to the monastery at Muro Lucano, a crumbling hilltop complex, now abandoned by its monks and repurposed by Charles's soldiers. She had visited it in her youth. It had once been a place of scripture and song. Now it reeked of damp earth and mildew. When they arrived, there were no priests, no prayers, just a broken courtyard and a single iron hook mounted in the archway of the cloister. Rainwater dripped from the stone like sweat. One of the soldiers dismounted, approached the old well, and drew out a thick coil of rope, already knotted at the end. It had been used before. Joanna watched with calm detachment. "So this is it," she said softly. "No trial, no confession, not even a priest to lie on God's behalf." The soldiers did not answer. One muttered a Latin phrase under his breath. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse. The man with the grey beard approached her again, his hands shaking. He held the rope as if it might bite him. But Joanna held his gaze. Her voice was firm, almost kind. "Do not be afraid, I forgive you." The execution was not clean. She was not tied properly. The knot slipped. She choked, not instantly, but slowly, legs trembling, hands grasping at the air. The soldiers looked away. One vomited in the grass. Another knelt and refused to rise. When it was over, they left her hanging for hours. No fanfare, no pronouncement, no witnesses beyond the cold, unblinking hills. The body of Joanna I of Naples, queen for nearly 4 decades, was eventually cut down and buried in secret. No tomb, no epitaph, no ceremony. And yet, even in death, she was not silent. Whispers of her ghost began within weeks, seen in shadowed corridors, heard in cloisters where bells no longer rang. Mothers told tales of her to frighten their daughters into obedience. Monks returning years later claimed the wind in the hills sometimes carried her name. Joanna, the woman who ruled, the woman who died without kneeling. For a while there was silence. After the quiet murder of Queen Joanna, sheened in the monastery of Muro Lucano, the world did not tremble. No bells tolled in Naples, no chroniclers scratched her passing into gilded books beneath cathedral domes. Charles of Durazzo had ensured that her death would be unnoticed, a quiet correction, a disappearing act, an unpersoning. But power leaves a vacuum, and a queen's absence cannot be swept beneath the stone. It began with a rumor drifting south through the mountains like fog. Joanna had not died, some said. She had escaped. The body was not hers. The hanging had been staged. She had been taken by loyalists across the sea, hidden away in a convent under another name, waiting, always waiting, to reclaim what was rightfully hers. The stories had no author, no source, but they spread with the urgency of desperation. Because Charles of Durazzo, now styling himself as Charles III, King of Naples, had inherited not peace, but a haunted crown. Though he sat on her throne, wore her coronation ring, and walked her marble halls, he found little joy in conquest. The Neapolitan court, once known for its poetry and grace, had turned brittle. Nobles no longer smiled when they bowed. Ambassadors kept their visits short. Even the palace hounds seemed to bark more often. It was not guilt that troubled Charles. It was fear. Joanna had been many things, controversial, contradictory, even cruel. But she had also been a symbol of endurance, of female rule, of a kingdom that had, for nearly 40 years, danced at the edge of war and held firm. With her gone, everything wobbled. Revolts broke out in the countryside. Charles's tax collectors were attacked on the roads. Merchants grumbled that their ships no longer found favor in Genoa and Pisa. Bandits, once kept at bay by Joanna's treaties with the rural barons, returned like wolves. And worse still, Charles had made an enemy of the Pope. When he murdered Joanna under the blessing of Urban VI, He had gambled that the Avignon papacy would crumble. It did not. Clement VII, the so-called anti-pope, still held sway across France, Aragon, and Scotland. His cardinals were furious. His scribes wrote treatises condemning the butcher of queens. And in the echoing chambers of Avignon, a whisper grew. Joanna had been a martyr. Soon, art followed politics. A miniature appeared in the court of Provence, painted by an anonymous hand. It showed Joanna in a white gown, arms raised, haloed by golden light, standing above a bound and bleeding Charles. The meaning was clear. The Queen had risen.
It was blasphemy, it was propaganda, and it was effective.
Across Europe, opinions began to shift. Where once Joanna had been suspected of murdering her first husband, now she was seen as a victim of dynastic cruelty. Where once she had been called indulgent or proud, now her cultural patronage was celebrated. Where once her enemies painted her as a Jezebel, poets now called her the widow of justice. Charles III, surrounded by shifting loyalties and a restless city, could not kill a legacy. Even as he minted new coins, reshaped the laws, and commissioned new frescoes erasing her likeness from palace walls, he found her name returning in prayers, in gossip, in the dreams of those who still believed in a softer Naples. And then came the woman in white. The first sighting was reported in the late summer of 1382. A soldier, drunk and stumbling back through the alleyways of Muro Lucano, claimed he saw her, pale, barefoot, her braids still damp from the noose. She stood beneath the archway where she had died, hands outstretched, as if in warning. By winter the stories multiplied. She appeared in the chapel where she had once prayed as a child, in the abandoned monastery, sobbing behind locked doors, in the mountains, walking barefoot on snow, leaving no footprints. Even in Naples itself, among the cloisters of Castelnuovo, servants whispered of a coldness in the air, a faint scent of lilies, and soft footsteps long after midnight. Whether it was grief, guilt, or hysteria, no one could say. But those who had once served her began to speak again. A steward recovered a letter she had written in captivity, a final plea to the Pope, denouncing her impending murder and begging that her death not go unnoticed. A nun claimed to possess a scrap of her gown, smuggled from the execution site. One knight, long silent, confessed that he had watched her die and had done nothing. Charles, now paranoid, began to dream of her nightly. He refused to sleep in any room she had once used. He dismissed the staff she had appointed. He ordered the destruction of every painting, coin, or book bearing her name. And still, she would not vanish. One chronicler wrote, "He rules a kingdom of her memory." And far to the north, a young girl in France, just 8 years old, was given a storybook by her tutor. Inside, a tale of a queen wronged by her cousin, who died not in shame, but in dignity. That girl's name was Jeanne d'Arc. For Charles of Durazzo, the year following Joanna's death should have been triumphant. He had crushed a rival, secured his claim, and returned the crown of Naples to the Hungarian line. His war, blessed by the Pope himself, had been swift and absolute, but something had begun to rot at the center of his victory. The chroniclers of the time rarely speak of Charles directly, not because he was forgettable, but because he was feared. His court was not one of celebration, but of surveillance. He trusted no one. Advisers were dismissed. Spies were everywhere. Servants were made to swear oaths not just of loyalty, but of silence. Even his wife, Margaret of Durazzo, once his closest confidant, now kept her distance. His paranoia grew like mold in a locked chamber. Behind the scenes, the consequences of his actions unfurled like slow poison. First came the revolt in Apulia, led by a minor baron who had once feasted at Joanna's table. Then came the refusal of the French court to recognize his claim. They called him a murderer and, worse, a usurper. Trade routes tightened. Italian cities hedged their alliances, no longer certain whether to treat Charles as a monarch or a man marked for divine punishment. And then the church itself began to flinch. Urban VI, the Pope who had given Charles permission to invade, proved to be unstable, a man driven more by fury than faith. He excommunicated cardinals, turned on his own allies, and, in time, came to see Charles not as a servant of God, but as a liability. Charles had counted on papal loyalty as a shield. Instead, he found himself facing the sharp edge of its judgment. By the end of 1383, Urban VI, the very pontiff who had blessed Joanna's destruction, began to question Charles's role in her death. Political necessity gave way to scandal. Rome whispered of sin. In response, Charles doubled down. He arrested dissenters, tortured suspected rebels. He even had the remaining supporters of Joanna hunted down, imprisoned, and, in some cases, quietly killed. His palace became a place of locked doors and restless sleep. And all the while, Joanna's name returned, again and again, in unexpected places. A ballad emerged in Sicily, sung by fishermen on the shore. The queen they hung still walks the strand, her braid undone by ghostly hand. Beware, beware the stolen crown, the mountain wind will drag you down. It spread faster than Charles could contain it. Minstrels carried the tune to taverns in Rome, to gardens in Provence, and eventually into the halls of Charles's own castle, where his youngest daughter was heard humming it beneath her breath. He slapped her. That was the day his wife stopped speaking to him. Even his allies in Hungary began to falter. They had supported Charles to restore their family's honor after the murder of Prince Andrew, Joanna's first husband. But now that Joanna was dead, the blood feud was technically settled. Charles had no more use, no more divine justification. His war had created a vacuum, not a legacy.
And into that vacuum came another ghost.
Not of Joanna this time, but of another king. In 1385, Charles received news from Hungary. King Louis III, his distant relative and former protector, had died. The throne now passed to his daughter Mary, a girl of barely 12, and to her mother, Queen Elizabeth, as regent. It should have been a moment of opportunity. Instead, it was the spark that would burn Charles alive. Ambitious and restless, Charles turned his eyes north. He believed the crown of Hungary was his by right, his claim stronger than any woman's, stronger than a child's. He had taken one kingdom, he would take another. He raised an army once more. But Hungary was not Naples. The court was wary. The nobility bristled. And though he entered the kingdom in a swirl of trumpets and banners, he would not leave it again alive. For now, though, he basked in illusion. He was king of Naples. He would soon be king of Hungary. He had erased the woman who had once stood in his way. But as winter thickened and the bells in Naples rang thin and cold, there were rumors that a tunnel beneath Castelnuovo had grown colder still.
A cell.
A candle never stayed lit there. Some said it was where Joanna had once wept in secret. Others said her ghost had returned to it. But Charles, they whispered, had started locking his bedroom door at night. Not against assassins or thieves,
but against the dead.
Charles of Durazzo had once believed himself untouchable. He had conquered Naples with a sword blessed by the Pope. He had silenced a queen and claimed her throne. He had walked the marble corridors of Castelnuovo not as an heir, but as a master. But in the final days of 1385, with snow falling across the Carpathians and wordless rumors haunting every stone of his court, he began to realize a bitter truth. Joanna's death had not secured his rule. It had cursed it. By the end of that year, Charles no longer rode without a dozen guards at his side. In Naples, he began holding audiences only in broad daylight. Tapestries were removed from the palace halls, not to be cleaned, but because he believed spies hid behind them. His meals were tasted by 3 men before he ever lifted a spoon. Some called it madness. Others, those who knew the shadows of power, called it guilt. In January of 1386, he crossed into Hungary to claim his second crown. The journey was slow. Bitter cold froze the wheels of his carriages. Villages along the route offered no feasts, no tributes. Charles saw his banners hung beside empty windows. People did not cheer. They watched. He pressed on, convinced that the throne would change everything, that once he was crowned King of Hungary, the sins of Naples would be buried in new gold. On February 5, 1386, in the Cathedral of Székesfehérvár, Charles was crowned King of Hungary. The crown of Saint Stephen, a relic older than nations, was placed on his brow by trembling hands. Latin chants rose into the vaulted ceilings, trumpets cried out, and Charles, eyes burning with triumph, looked upon a kingdom he believed had finally bowed to him. It was his last moment of peace. Only a month later, on March 17th, as Charles sat in his chamber, a knock came at the door. A page informed him that Queen Elizabeth of Bosnia, regent to the young Queen Mary, wished to meet him privately. Charles smiled. He had expected resistance from Elizabeth. Her late husband, King Louis III, had hoped for Mary to marry a Polish prince and secure a peaceful alliance. But now, with Charles crowned, surely she had changed her mind. He did not bring his guards. Inside the royal apartment, Elizabeth waited in mourning black, her daughter Mary silent at her side. Charles bowed, and then the door closed. What happened next would be whispered through Europe for generations. Accounts differ, but most agree Elizabeth made no pretense of diplomacy. She accused Charles of treachery, of theft, of murdering Joanna, a queen, a woman, a sovereign whose only crime had been to stand between Charles and his greed. Charles, stunned, began to speak, but before he could finish his sentence, the assassins emerged from behind the tapestries. They were not nobles, not soldiers. They were Slavic retainers loyal to Elizabeth, armed with knives, blunt blades, and a rope.
He struggled, screamed, but no one came.
One servant later claimed that he heard Charles begging not for mercy, but for absolution. "Forgive me, Joanna," he was said to have cried, though no one knows if that is true. The violence was swift, but not clean. The assassins struck him repeatedly, breaking bone and slicing flesh. The final blow came as he collapsed against the wall, a blade buried deep in the chest, beneath the ribs. He bled on the stone floor of a queen's chamber, just as Joanna had. For a day his body was left untouched, a warning. When it was finally removed, it was buried hastily, without ceremony. There were no bells, no procession, no crown placed on the casket. He had died as he had ruled, in shadows. News of his death spread quickly. In Naples, the people did not mourn. A few nobles quietly toasted to his passing. Among the clergy, murmurs of divine justice filled the chapels. And in the hill towns of Muro Lucano, old women nodded in silence. The queen had been avenged. But even in death, Charles left behind a deeper wound. The kingdom of Naples, now rudderless, collapsed into chaos. His son was too young, his wife too isolated. The noble houses, like starving hounds, turned on one another in pursuit of scraps from the throne. And above it all, the ghost of Joanna lingered, no longer a victim, no longer a question, but a reckoning. They never gave her a tomb. Not in marble, not in stone, not even a nameless patch of sacred earth marked with a cross. The body of Queen Joanna I, once ruler of Naples, Sicily, and Provence, was buried in secret, if it was buried at all. The exact place of her remains remains unknown to this day. Some say she lies beneath the cloister floor of the monastery where she was hanged, covered in silence and moss. Others believe her body was thrown into a dry well, too dangerous even in death to be honored with a grave. There are whispers that she was buried with stones in her mouth, a medieval superstition meant to prevent the dead from speaking through the mouths of the living. But speak she did. And not in words, but in legend, in nightmare, and in song. In the years following her death and Charles of Durazzo's bloody assassination in Hungary, a strange thing began to happen. Across Europe, the story of Joanna began to change. She was no longer the accused, the queen suspected of murdering her first husband, the monarch who dared defy popes and kings. She became something else, a martyr, a saint in shadow, a symbol of womanhood crushed under the boot of male ambition. Ballads were sung in French taverns of the queen without a grave. Illuminated manuscripts appeared depicting her trial, a fictional one, for no real trial had been held, in which she stood before angels while a pope with a serpent's tongue condemned her. Painters, especially in Provence and Avignon, created small devotional icons of her. Eyes upward, a noose replaced with a halo. She was canonized unofficially by the people. It was the opposite of Charles's design. He had hoped to erase her. Instead, he had transformed her into myth. The court of Avignon, still loyal to the line of anti-popes opposed to Urban VI, quietly declared her death a crime against the Church. Some whispered that her name should be read among the martyred queens, alongside saints who had died for their virtue or their God. Others, more daring, claimed she had been a prophetess, one who foresaw the schism of the Church and paid the price for speaking too early. In the countryside of Italy, women began naming their daughters Giovanna again. Midwives lit candles to her before deliveries. Fishermen carved her name into their boats for protection. A new kind of reverence was forming, one not sanctioned by any pope, but born from loss, from injustice, and from the lingering sense that something beautiful had been broken too soon. Meanwhile, Naples itself began to fracture. Without Charles, the Durazzo line struggled. His son, Ladislaus, was crowned in haste, but lacked the strength and charisma of his father. Joanna's loyalists, those few who had survived the purge, began to re-emerge, older, angrier, and determined not to let her memory fade. One of them, a former page turned knight named Raimondo, began gathering pieces of Joanna's life like relics. A broken pendant once belonging to her, a page from a letter smuggled out of Castel San Fele, the cracked remains of a statue once displayed in Castel Nuovo before Charles ordered it destroyed. These fragments became a shrine, not in a church, but in a cellar beneath the city, lit with tallow candles guarded by silence. Men and women came to weep there, to pray, to remember. The story spread. If you brought your sorrow to Joanna's corner, she would listen. If you were unjustly accused, she would shield you. If you had been silenced, she would speak for you in the dark. Even centuries later, long after the ruins of that hidden shrine had collapsed, those who wandered the narrow alleys of old Naples would speak of the Regina Senza Corona, the Crownless Queen, who walked among them. They claimed she was seen most often in moments of crisis, when the plague came, when the Spanish sacked the city, when Vesuvius roared in smoke. A woman in green, silent, weeping, her braid undone. No one ever saw her face, but they knew it was hers, because every time her name was whispered, in the flicker of candlelight, in the margins of forgotten books, in the lips of women too bold for their time, something stirred beneath the stone. She had died without a trial, a grave, or a final prayer. But she had not disappeared. The tale of Joanna's final days could have easily slipped into silence, as so many women's stories had before hers, swallowed by official records, redacted by church scribes, twisted into villainy by the victors. But her legacy did something that no sword, no crown, no papal decree could undo. It endured. In hidden chapels and secret gatherings, her story was told, not with fear, but with trembling reverence. She was not called Joanna the Accused or Joanna the Deposed. Among the people, she was simply La Regina Piangente, the Weeping Queen. What haunted most who repeated the tale was not the cruelty of her death, nor the betrayal by blood, but the braid. They said her braid had remained perfectly coiled even in the final moment, cascading over one shoulder like a ribbon of dusk. No matter how many times she was seen, in ghost stories, in visions, in dreams, the braid was always there, as if time had frozen it. Some claimed it was because her dignity had survived when all else had been stripped. Others whispered a darker belief that her soul had been bound into that final gesture, a knot not just of hair, but of injustice. In Neapolitan markets, you could buy amulets carved in the shape of a single twisted plait. Women tied their hair in imitation of her final look during court trials, hoping for strength. Prostitutes in the Spanish Quarter wore green sashes in her memory, honoring a woman punished for daring to rule like a man and feel like a woman. But the fascination went further than folk customs. Joanna's death, violent, political, and veiled in silence, became the subject of a secret play circulated underground in the early 15th century, performed in whispers behind monastery walls. Its title, La Corda Regina, the Queen's rope. It portrayed her as a Christ-like figure, betrayed by her Judas cousin and crucified not with nails, but with rope. Of course the church tried to destroy it. Copies were burned, performers excommunicated. But like Joanna herself, the story slipped through the cracks. One weathered manuscript of La Corda Regina survived in the archives of a Franciscan monastery, hidden behind forged title pages. A historian centuries later would find it and weep, not just at the beauty of the language, but at the power of a forgotten woman's grief. The final lines of the play spoke as if from Joanna's mouth. "Hang me, but I do not fall. Strip me, but I am not bare. Erase me, but I speak through your daughters." Not long after Charles's death, one of his own courtiers, a man once loyal to the king's purge, reportedly confessed on his deathbed. He claimed he had delivered the noose to Muro Lucano himself. He remembered Joanna's silence, her final blessing, her refusal to cry out. But what haunted him most, he said, was what happened after. As her body swung in the cloister, the storm broke. Rain poured from the heavens, thunder roared over the mountains, and lightning struck the old olive tree beside the chapel. The tree did not burn, it split in two, and from its center a pale green vine grew. Nothing had ever grown there before. The locals called it La Vite della Regina, the Queen's vine. They claimed it bloomed only once a year, on the anniversary of her death. And the flower it bore? Small, wild, white, shaped uncannily like a knotted braid. In time, even skeptics found themselves drawn to the strange persistence of her name. A Jesuit scholar in the 17th century remarked bitterly that Joanna's ghost has more faithful than the church. And by the Enlightenment, when the world was beginning to reassess the narratives written by power, historians returned to her story with fresh eyes. She was not a footnote, she was a cipher. A woman whose life reflected the fragile, furious dance between love and politics, mercy and vengeance, justice and memory. And what began as a simple question, did she order her husband's murder, had become something far greater.
What does it cost to be a woman with power?
That question would echo in the minds of queens and rebels for centuries. In France, Marie Antoinette would be accused of decadence. In England, Elizabeth of Bethlen would be praised only after outliving her enemies. And in Naples, statues of male rulers would rise, then fall, and still, in back alleys and whispered prayers, the people would say, "But none wore the crown like Joanna." Time passed. Empires rose, empires fell. New kings sat on the throne of Naples, some beloved, most forgotten. But Joanna's story, though buried beneath centuries of politics, remained, not in cathedrals or state histories, but in murkier places. Lullabies, funeral rites, half-remembered tales whispered at the edge of candlelight. One story in particular endured. A legend passed from nursemaids to noble daughters, from old widows to young rebels, about a woman in a green gown who appeared at moments of great decision and of great danger. She was always silent, her eyes silver with uncried tears, her footsteps leaving no trace. They said she came to women most of all, to the girl about to be married off for politics, to the widow facing exile, to the accused heretic imprisoned without trial, to the midwife blamed for a noble's stillborn child. The woman in green did not speak. She simply appeared, her braid trailing behind her like a line of ink on forgotten parchment. And when she did, something always changed. A door unlocked, a rope snapped, a heart stiffened into defiance. The gown, they said, was always the same shade, deep forest green, like the hills above Muro Lucano in spring. The color of life, yes, but also the color of vengeance, of growth through decay, of something buried refusing to rot. In the port city of Gaeta, a noblewoman accused of poisoning her husband was sentenced to hang. On the morning of her execution, she walked past a mirror and screamed, not at herself, but at what stood behind her, a woman in green, face shadowed, watching in silence. The guards found her moments later, the noose cut and the cell door open. They never caught her, That same year, in a convent near Salerno, a nun recorded in her private journal that she had seen the Virgin Mary in a dream. Only, the woman wore no veil and her hair was braided in the old Neapolitan style. When the nun asked her name, the figure simply turned and vanished. The next day, the convent's tyrannical abbess fell ill and was removed from power. The nun, though never canonized, became revered as a visionary. But it wasn't just ghost stories and dreams. By the 1500s, a quiet literary movement emerged in southern Italy, mostly anonymous, mostly banned, that reimagined Joanna's life not as tragedy, but as resistance. Pamphlets circulated bearing titles like Regina e Ribelle, Queen and Rebel, Sotto il Cappio, La Corona, Beneath the Noose, The Crown, and Una donna tra i lupi, A woman among wolves. Each retelling distorted the facts, but none dared to remove the braid. The braid had become her scepter. In the age of inquisitions and witch trials, women began weaving hidden symbols of Joanna into their dress, a green thread stitched along the hem, a plated necklace, even a single silver ring worn on the left hand, rumored to mark those who swore themselves to her memory. The church tried to stamp it out. But how do you kill a story already buried in the blood of a city? In 1609, a visiting Spanish bishop ordered a crackdown on Joannisti cult activity in Naples. He seized amulets, burned manuscripts, banned songs. He even had a woman whipped in the market square for telling her daughter a bedtime tale that ended with the words, "And so Queen Joanna walked into the mist and she was never owned again." A week later, the bishop was found dead in his study. The cause was ruled natural causes, but the guards said they had heard someone, or something, walking the halls that night. No shoes, just the soft whisper of skirts on stone. They never found the woman. They never found the braid. There once hung, in the study of a minor Neapolitan prince, a painting that no guest dared comment on. It was not large, smaller than a breadboard, framed in wood that had cracked with humidity. It was unsigned. It bore no royal crest. But the subject was unmistakable. A woman seated beneath a stone arch, her hands folded in her lap, a dark green gown cloaking her like ivy over a tomb.
And her hair was braided.
Not in the fashionable style of the 17th century, but in the old way, coiled over one shoulder like a rope prepared for hoisting. Her eyes looked away into the distance where no viewer could follow. The portrait had no name, but in whispered circles it was known as La Condannata, the condemned. How the painting came into the prince's possession was a matter of rumour. Some claimed it was smuggled from a convent destroyed by fire. Others said it had been found in the cellar of a ruined castle beneath a floorboard, wrapped in cloth alongside a single, dried white flower. A few claimed it had been painted by a woman, one of Joanna's own descendants, cloistered in France, cursed with visions. Whatever its origin, the image became dangerous. Visitors who lingered before it too long felt dizzy. One maid claimed the woman's eyes changed when you weren't looking. A governess refused to enter the room entirely, insisting the woman breathed when no one spoke. The prince, amused at first, became obsessed. He spent hours alone with the portrait, often refusing dinner, even locking the door behind him. He scoured the libraries for texts on Joanna I. He commissioned a genealogy that linked his family, however weakly, to the House of Anjou. He ordered a replica of the braid in the painting made by the city's finest jeweller, worn only beneath his clothes. He began to refer to himself privately as Il Custode, the keeper. But Naples, in the throes of Spanish control and papal surveillance, had no patience for cults of memory. And the portrait, it seemed, remembered too much. One winter, a Dominican friar visiting from Rome was invited to dine at the prince's estate. During the meal, he was shown the painting. He stared for a long time, and then quietly he left. 2 months later, a papal envoy arrived. The portrait was seized. The prince was placed under house arrest. No official charges were filed, but every book in his library was removed. His servants were dismissed. His name, once respected, faded from court. He died 3 years later, mad and whispering in his sleep. The portrait was said to have been destroyed, burned in a monastery kiln along with other dangerous effigies. But not everyone believed it. Some said the friar, before leaving, had already arranged for a duplicate to be smuggled away, that it travelled through the hands of secret Joanna loyalists down the coast, across the sea, into the salons of revolutionary France. Others claimed there was never a second copy.
Only that La Condonata never burned.
That when the monk lifted it from the frame, the canvas shuddered, and he dropped it, pale and shaking, convinced that what he held was no mere painting, but a window, to where no one could say. Years later, in a forgotten corner of Provence, an elderly woman would claim to have seen the portrait in her childhood, tucked into a bookshop attic, veiled in silk, and hidden beneath a copy of La Corda Regina. When asked what the woman in the green gown looked like, she did not say beautiful. She said unfinished. Her face wasn't fully there, she explained, like she was still deciding who she needed to be. The girl who heard that story grew up to write political pamphlets under a false name. She signed each one with a braid. In the archive of the Abbey of Santa Chiara, a sun-bleached complex half forgotten by time and blistered by earthquakes, a dusty folio was discovered in 1732 during a restoration of the old scriptorium. It had no proper title, no heraldic seal. Only a faded piece of lambskin tied with red thread and labelled in a hesitant Latin hand, Epistolae Regiae non lectae, royal letters unread. The monks who found them didn't understand their significance. The Latin was strange, half courtly, half vernacular, and the handwriting feminine, slanted, too elegant for the masculine legal texts they were trained to preserve. The bundle was nearly discarded, but one monk, Brother Alfeo, curious by nature and aging without fear of scandal, began to copy the words into a private notebook. He did not live to finish, but what he did transcribe revealed a voice that should have been lost to history. It was Queen Joanna. The folio contained letters written during her final weeks in Castel San Fele. Letters never sent, perhaps never meant to be. There were 16 in total, addressed not to allies or politicians, but to people long gone from her life. Her first husband Andrew, her late grandfather Robert, her child who had died in infancy, and to her former enemies, including Charles of Durazzo. They were not royal decrees. They were confessions, reflections, defences. Each line carried the weight of someone who knew their life was being erased, and yet refused to let memory fade without a fight. In one, addressed to her unborn daughter, I write to you though you never drew breath. Perhaps in some kinder world you are queen, and I am the story you tell when you doubt yourself. I want you to know I ruled. Not always well, but always with my heart open. In another, written to Charles just days before her death, you think you have won, but you do not yet know the price of what you take. You will sit where I sat, hear the same lies, smell the same fear, and when your crown grows heavy, may you remember whose blood oils the hinges of your gates. But the final letter, the one Brother Alfeo copied fully before his death, was addressed to any who still remember. A letter to the future, to us. If you find these words, then I was not fully lost. They burned my image, they scattered my bones, they buried me in silence. But a woman's voice, once spoken in truth, lingers longer than the brass of kings. Do not weep for me. Take the braid, take the crown, make of them what I could not. The letters were quietly reshelved after Brother Alfeo's passing. No one dared present them publicly. The Church considered Joanna's legacy a dangerous temptation, too easily repurposed by rebels, reformers, and those who challenged divine authority. But someone remembered. Decades later, a seamstress working in Naples, a quiet woman with no claim to nobility, somehow acquired a translation of the final letter. She copied the words by hand onto a small strip of linen and sewed it into the hem of her wedding dress. Her daughter would do the same, and her granddaughter, until 2 centuries later, a woman named Elena, imprisoned during an anti-fascist uprising, would whisper those lines to her cellmates in the night. They didn't know who Joanna was, but they remembered the words. And when Elena was released, she embroidered them into a green banner that she carried into protest marches for women's suffrage. The braid had not unraveled. It fluttered like a ghost through the crowded plaza. A narrow strip of emerald cloth held aloft by a woman in boots worn to the sole, eyes bright with exhaustion. Stitched across its length in gold thread were the words once written by a queen doomed to silence. "Take the braid, take the crown, make of them what I could not." No one at that 1923 demonstration in Naples knew the full story.
Not then.
To them, the banner was a symbol of defiance, a relic of whispered lineage, passed from grandmother to mother to daughter. Elena, the woman who carried it, was known only as a dressmaker's apprentice who'd spent 2 years imprisoned for hiding banned pamphlets under bolts of velvet. But she walked like a queen that day, the cloth rippling behind her like the train of a coronation gown. They called her La Signora Verde, the lady in green. That protest ended in tear gas and batons. The banner was confiscated. Elena vanished into the tangle of the fascist regime. But photographs survived, grainy images published in underground newsletters showing the curve of thread, the tilt of her jaw, the strange familiarity in the way she stood. It was the stance of a woman who would not kneel. Historians later identified the banner's text as a paraphrase from the so-called lost letters of Joanna of Naples. At the time, no one cared. But in the decades that followed, as the ruins of war gave way to the reassembly of nations, something strange happened. The banner reappeared. Not the original, but versions of it. One unfurled at a 1955 university strike in Turin, carried by a student whose grandmother had been Elena's cellmate. Another surfaced at a women's march in Palermo in 1972, then again, decades later, in the hands of protesters rallying for abortion rights in Rome, this time accompanied by a chant. She ruled, she bled, she braided, she led. It was never officially adopted, never mass-printed, but still the colour green began to appear wherever women stood up and refused to be silent. And along with it, the braid. In Berlin, a mural appeared overnight on a concrete wall. A faceless woman with a single heavy plait resting over her shoulder. Beneath it, the phrase "Una donna tra I lupi," a woman among wolves. In Buenos Aires, a theatre company performed La Corda Regina in secret, rebranded as La Voz Atada, the tied voice. Their lead actress wore a replica of Joanna's green gown, stitched from memory, no pattern, no historical photographs. In 2007, a historian from the University of Naples delivered a quiet lecture titled The Erased Queen, Gender and Justice in Angevin, Naples. It wasn't widely attended, but one journalist present wrote afterward, "It was like hearing the voice of someone who died centuries ago, still angry, still asking to be heard." That journalist, unaware of the banner, the play, or the shrine beneath Castel Nuovo, would later become a best-selling author, penning The Braided Queen, a historical novel inspired by Joanna's final days. The book was banned in 3 countries. It won awards in 5. But not all the echoes were public. In the Naples municipal records, an anonymous citizen submitted a proposal to rename a square in the historic centre. The name they suggested, Piazza Regina Senza Corona, Square of the Crownless Queen. The proposal was denied, but someone, no one knew who, painted the name on a nearby stone wall in white letters the following week. It was scrubbed off by morning, painted again the next night, and again. Eventually the city stopped scrubbing. The wall remains. Travellers pass it every day, most without notice. But occasionally a visitor will pause, trace the letters, and look up, just for a moment, toward the shadow of Castel Nuovo rising above the roofs. And if they stand very still, they say the wind smells faintly of lilies.
And old stone and rain.
By the early 21st century, the story of Queen Joanna I had become many things: a historical curiosity, a symbol of feminist resistance, a political metaphor, a whispered prayer. But to a quiet lineage of women, artists, teachers, midwives, archivists, She was something more intimate. She was memory with a heartbeat. There were no temples built in her name, no official feast days. The church still refused to discuss her murder, let alone acknowledge her final letters. But despite all this, or perhaps because of it, Joanna's presence threaded itself invisibly through centuries of dissent. She did not reign anymore, but she ruled the imagination. A professor in Lyon began tracing the lives of female rulers once dismissed by mainstream histories. Her work revealed a strange pattern. Nearly every one of them had been connected, in letters or reputation, to Joanna. Margaret Queen of Denmark, who ruled a pan-Scandinavian union and never remarried, had referenced Joanna's courage in a letter to her sister. Isabella of Castile, in a surviving court sermon, had invoked the strength of the Naples widow. Even Catherine de' Medici, often cast as a manipulator, kept a miniature of a woman with a green ribbon on her writing desk. That professor, upon publishing her findings, was asked at a conference, "Are you saying Joanna inspired queens for 600 years?" She replied,
I'm saying she never truly died.
Meanwhile, in Italy, a young doctoral candidate at the University of Bologna uncovered a secret archive in the dusty recesses of a defunct noble estate. Inside were letters dated to the 1500s, coded and unsigned, discussing a society of women calling themselves le figlie della regina scomparsa, the daughters of the vanished queen. The letters spoke of meetings at full moon, of clandestine teachings, of rituals involving braiding one another's hair while speaking names of those unjustly punished. The group was not political, it was preservationist. Their purpose, the letters claimed, was to keep memory from turning to myth, to ensure that Joanna's death would not be the only thing for which she was remembered. The researcher published a small article in an obscure journal. It gained little traction until a well-known playwright read it and adapted the letters into a stage drama, La Regina e il Fuoco, The Queen and the Fire. The play ran for 2 years. Women came dressed in green. Some wept openly during the hanging scene. Others stood silently during curtain call, holding braided ropes instead of bouquets. The play was eventually adapted into a short film. It didn't win awards, it didn't need to. It had already become legend. And then in 2016, something truly unexpected happened. A team of archaeologists began excavating an old well beneath the ruins of the monastery of San Francesco in Muro Lucano, long rumoured to be near the site of Joanna's execution. What they found stunned them. At the bottom, nestled among collapsed stone and bone fragments, lay a length of braided fabric, green, rotted through in places, but still intact. No one could say for certain what it was. Some claimed it was merely a monk's sash. Others insisted it was a piece of her final gown. But what captured the world's attention wasn't the object itself. It was what was sewn into it. In thread so faded it took ultraviolet light to read were the words, "Senza corona ma non piegata," without a crown but never bowed. The news made headlines for a day. Then the world, with its haste and headlines, moved on. But not everyone forgot. That very same year, in a small town square in Puglia, a group of schoolgirls reenacted Joanna's final letter as part of a summer festival. Their teacher, who had translated the letter herself from Latin, said afterward, they understood her. At 10 years old they knew, not just who she was, but why she matters. The girls wore green sashes. At the end of their performance, instead of bowing, they stood straight, hands clasped, braids over their shoulders. The applause was quiet. But the wind that passed through the olive trees nearby smelled faintly of old pages.
And wildflowers.
In the vaulted silence of modern museums, where centuries of art and armour wait beneath sterilized glass, one voice never appears in the official plaques. Joanna of Naples. You will not find her face hanging in the Uffizi beside other queens and saints. Her statue does not guard bridges or courtyards. In textbooks, she is often reduced to a single paragraph. Wed young, suspected of murder, lost her crown, died mysteriously. A tragic figure, quickly moved past. But if you ask the docents quietly, the ones who have spent years tending dusty storage rooms, handling delicate scrolls, or cataloguing misattributed portraits. They'll tell you, Joanna is there.
Hiding in the margins.
In one manuscript, a feminine hand has sketched a tiny crown above a name that had been scratched out. In another, a nun's prayer book from 1410 contains an inserted page, a poem written in Neapolitan dialect, signed only with the initials G.R., Giovanna Regina. The poem ends, "You may erase my face from your coins, but you will find me in every woman who says no. It is not famous, it is not framed, but it has been copied and recopied for centuries. In the shadow of the Vatican archives, where entire histories are buried under lock and key, there exists a restricted folio titled De Regibus Hereticis, on heretic kings. Among its pages lies a single entry for Joanna. The tone is scathing, the theology heavy-handed, but someone, perhaps a bored monk, perhaps a quiet sympathizer, has written in the margin beside her name,
If this is heresy, let God call me sister.
That is the nature of Joanna's survival. She does not live in the gold-leaf pages of official history, but in the cracks, the folds, the scribbled notes passed between generations of women who knew what it meant to be silenced. And sometimes, rarely, but not never, her name surfaces in unexpected places. In 1999, during renovations of a crumbling villa outside Naples, a carpenter discovered a locked chest behind a false wall. Inside were dozens of yellowed pages, family records, ledgers, receipts, and among them a child's diary from the 1800s. The child's name was Amelia. She had drawn a small picture of a queen with long braided hair and a sad smile. Below the sketch, she had written,
Mama says she was hung for being too loud, but I think she just wouldn't say sorry.
The pages are now housed in a private collection. But before they were removed, one photographer took a high-resolution image of that page. It now circulates quietly online, passed from artist to artist, activist to activist. Underneath, many add the same caption,
Joanna speaks where we cannot.
because to be erased and remembered at once is the fate of many women. But few have spoken from beyond the veil as clearly, or as persistently, as the queen without a grave. The braid had always been a symbol
Of dignity, of defiance, of a life that refused to come undone even at the edge of the noose.
By the 2020s, it had become something more, a silent gesture passed between strangers, an emblem stitched into protest banners, scrawled in chalk on courthouse steps, tattooed discreetly behind ears, on ribs, across the heart. It appeared in places Joanna never walked, in languages she never spoke. In Tehran, a young woman arrested for defying a morality law carved a braid into the wall of her cell with a fingernail. In Poland, during protests for reproductive rights, green scarves tied in braids fluttered from balconies. In São Paulo, a writer published a children's book titled A Rainha que não curvou a cabeça, the queen who did not bow her head. It told Joanna's story in metaphor, a bird in a cage who sang so loudly the sky learned her song. The book was banned. It sold out in weeks. In 2021, a digital artist known only as Lira87 released an animated short titled Regina Scomparsa. No voices, no music. Only the sound of wind and bells as a faceless queen walked barefoot through empty palaces, her braid growing longer with every step. The final scene showed her standing on a mountain, facing a city below where every woman, young and old, wore the braid she once had. It went viral in 17 countries, but not everyone celebrated her. In the shadow corridors of power, in boardrooms, in pulpits, in courtrooms, Joanna's name still stung like incense to a sinner. They did not say it aloud, but they recognized the threat, a woman who refused shame. A legacy they could not kill. In one country, a politician dismissed a woman's legal protest as emotional hysterics. The next morning, the steps of the parliament were found covered in braided green ribbons. No one claimed responsibility, but the message was understood. In another, a female journalist arrested for reporting on domestic violence used her one permitted phone call not to contact a lawyer, but to recite the final lines of Joanna's letter to the future. The recording was leaked. It was played at her funeral when she died in custody 5 days later. And in Naples, her city, something changed, quietly, in the air. The square, once proposed for renaming, remained officially nameless, but locals began calling it Piazza della Treccia, Braided Square. A florist left a single white bloom at its center each Sunday. Street musicians began to play a soft tune at dusk, slow, minor, mournful. No words, only a melody. Then one autumn morning under a pale sky, someone wheeled a small cart into the square. It carried only a stone. On it, hand-chiseled in imperfect but loving letters, Joanna I, Regina di Napoli, 1326, 1382, without a crown, without a grave, never without a voice. No one knew who had placed it there. No one removed it. Even the city's bureaucrats, pressed by reporters, clergy, tourists, issued only this: "Let the people have their memory. It costs the state nothing. It costs silence everything." And so the braid remained. Not on statues, not on coins, but in stories. Passed from mouth to mouth across centuries, a symbol woven through laughter and tears, through defiance and prayer, through girls who would not bow and women who would not forget. She had been hanged in shadow, but she rose in fire. History is a house with many locked rooms. In some, the windows are thrown wide, names illuminated, faces chiseled in marble, voices echoing in cathedral vaults and senate halls. But in others, dust settles thick over truth. The doors creak when opened, and what waits inside does not always match the myths we were taught. Joanna of Naples was once placed in one of those forgotten rooms. A queen accused of murder, a ruler branded hysterical, a woman strangled in obscurity by the very cousin she had once welcomed as kin. Her story had every reason to disappear, buried by kings, popes, and centuries of silence. And yet, her voice survived. Not because it was louder than others, but because it refused to stay still. It changed shapes, it crossed borders, it slipped between fingers like silk, and then returned as steel. In a small museum in southern Italy, near the hills where she once ruled and died, there now sits a modest glass case. Inside, no crown, no jeweled scepter. Only 3 things: a length of old green fabric, gently braided, a handwritten translation of her final letter, and a mirror. No plaque explains the mirror, but if you stand before it long enough, something becomes clear. You are looking at the next keeper of her memory. 'Cause Joanna's story was never just about a queen. It was about what it means to live in a world that demands you shrink. To stand when you are told to kneel. To speak when you are ordered to be silent. To braid your hair when they try to cut you down. And so she remains, not in castles, but in moments. In every whispered no spoken by a woman in a locked room. In every green ribbon tied to a gate or worn beneath a shirt. In every daughter told she is too much, too loud, too bold, and chooses not to listen. They did not give her a grave, so we became one.
Every voice that carries her name.
Every breath that remembers. She is not waiting to be found, she is waiting to be followed. And the path is simple. Take the braid, take the crown, make of them what she could not. Let Joanna rule.
At last,